Welcome to the debates. Think about the absolute exhaustion of, well, constantly walking on eggshells in your own home. You try to set a simple boundary, right? But suddenly you are the villain because the other person deploys this calculated, weaponized, silent treatment.
Yeah, and they'll often mask it as, being depressed or just needing space, but it is actually a highly predatory tactic. A covert narcissist uses that exact silent treatment or, these subtle micro insults to completely dismantle your reality.
Exactly. It destroys your sanity. And today we are unpacking the psychological architecture of personal boundaries, specifically when you're dealing with these darker, manipulative dynamics. The core question is, are boundaries fundamentally relational tools designed to maintain and heal connection?
Right. Or on the flip side, are they unilateral protective fortresses? Are they tactical enforcement mechanisms required to stop, well, boundary violators and covert narcissists from completely consuming your autonomy?
Now, I look at this through a trauma-informed, highly relational lens. I believe that boundaries are essentially bridges. They're collaborative communication tools meant to foster mutual respect and, prevent emotional stonewalling.
And I take a much more defensive behavioral profiling posture on this. I see boundaries as absolute protective shields. Because when you factor in systemic dysfunction or someone with rigid narcissistic traits, treating a boundary as a conversational tool is, frankly, a trap.
Well, let's start with that relational paradigm because I think it's where most people try to operate first. My perspective is that boundaries are a mechanism for healthy connection. If we look at the Gottman Institute's research, they outline this physiological phenomenon called flooding.
Right, where your body just goes into complete fight or flight.
Yes, exactly. Your heart rate spikes above 100 beats per minute. Your amygdala, which is the threat detection center of the brain, it literally hijacks your nervous system. It cuts off access to your prefrontal cortex.
Which means you lose all logic and verbal reasoning.
Right. You are physiologically incapable of hearing the other person. And victims of covert narcissists are constantly flooded because they are under subtle psychological attack. So to prevent the relationship from burning down, therapists teach the SAFE method.
Specify, assert, fairness, and enforce.
Yes. Instead of just walking away, you explicitly define the expectation. You say, I value our relationship, but I'm feeling overwhelmed and I need a 30-minute break. By asserting that limit clearly, you are giving them an instruction manual for how to love you. It's an act of profound kindness.
I hear the optimism in that, I really do, but I have to come at this from the profiler's angle. Treating boundaries as an instruction manual is a terrible trap when you are dealing with a covert narcissist.
Wait, how is clear communication a trap?
Because they don't lack an instruction manual, they don't lack awareness of your feelings, they lack respect for your autonomy. Covert narcissists thrive on power imbalances. If you try to build a relational bridge with someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, you are just inviting a hostile force inside your gates.
That is a really bleak view of human interaction, though. I mean, most boundary crossings start out as misunderstandings. If you don't use a communicative tool like an I statement, saying, I feel overwhelmed when X happens, how will they ever know they crossed a line?
Oh, they know. That's the insidious nature of covert gaslighting. Relying on communication as a primary vehicle for a boundary is exactly what leads victims straight into the jade trap.
The jade trap meaning justify, argue, defend, explain?
Exactly. You attempt to reason with someone who sees your independence as a threat. You use your perfectly crafted I statement and they immediately turned around. They play the ultimate victim.
Oh, right. The classic, I guess I'm just the worst partner in the world then.
Yes, or they use a micro insult. Wow, you're always so sensitive. I never even did that. You think the boundary is the conversation, so you keep talking, you keep jading. But you aren't explaining. You're handing them an itemized receipt of your emotional state that they can use as ammunition.
So the conversation itself becomes the vulnerability. The more you explain, the more they can twist your reality.
Precisely. You get exhausted, the boundary completely collapses. That is why in these dynamics, the boundary only exists in the consequence. It is hanging up the phone without an apology. it's walking away.
Okay, I see the logic for those extreme predatory situations, but if we look at the boundary continuum in the literature, boundaries exist on a spectrum, right? Porous to healthy to rigid.
And rigid boundaries have immense utility against rigid people.
But broadly applied, treating every boundary as a strict consequence pushes people into complete isolation. People with rigid boundaries avoid intimacy. They refuse to ask for help. They keep everyone at a distance. If we just tell listeners, don't bother communicating, just walk away, we deny people the chance to repair.
That entirely assumes the other person has the emotional maturity to apologize and adjust. But let's shift to family systems because this is where the communication model truly falls apart under pressure.
Actually, I think family systems are a perfect example of why boundaries are fundamentally relational. If we look at Harriet Lerner's work, The Dance of Anger, she explains the dynamic of the overfunctioner and the underfunctioner.
The classic codependent seesaw.
Right. In enmeshed families, one person manages everyone's emotions. They are the overfunctioner, holding the seesaw down. The other person slips into dependency. But Lerner shows that when the overfunctioner finally communicates a limit and stops managing everything, it forces the entire system to heal.
How so?
Well, it creates a psychological vacuum. The underfunctioner's feet finally hit the ground. They have to step up, take responsibility, and mature. The boundary corrects the imbalance and saves the family.
That is a utopian reading of enmeshment. Have you considered how covert narcissists use weaponized incompetence in that exact scenario?
You mean when they deliberately do a task poorly so you'll just take it back?
Exactly. When you step off the seesaw, they don't politely mature. They weaponize pity. They act entirely helpless. And society constantly demands that victims tolerate this under the guise that blood is thicker than water.
Yeah, the cultural pressure to conform is huge.
It is. So when you try to set that boundary, the family applies what Lerner calls change back pressure. And if you resist, you get an extinction burst.
An extinction burst, like when things get significantly worse before they get better?
Yes. Think of it like a broken elevator button. When the elevator doesn't arrive, you don't just take the stairs. You furiously mash the button 10 times in a row. You escalate. Toxic family members will mash the button. They test your new limits with severe guilt trips or rage.
Which is terrifying for the victim. It makes them feel like they're losing their mind.
Which is exactly the goal. So in that environment, treating a boundary as a tool to heal the dynamic keeps the victim actively engaged in a cycle of abuse. The only viable survival strategy is detachment in the gray rock method.
Okay, gray rocking. That's the practice of becoming as uninteresting and unresponsive as a literal gray rock, right?
Yes, but you have to understand why it works. It's about starving the psychological reward center. Covert manipulators get a dopamine hit from seeing you upset or defensive. Even negative engagement is supplied to them.
Right, because any reaction means they still have power over you.
Exactly. So gray rocking cuts off the dopamine. You give short, non-committal answers. You show no emotion. You don't communicate a boundary. You embody a wall. Eventually, they get bored and look elsewhere.
But gray rocking is so emotionally exhausting for the victim. You are essentially suppressing your entire authentic self just to survive your own living room. And I'm struggling with applying this broadly. Most listeners aren't dealing with a family of malignant psychopaths.
I would argue that subtle emotional immaturity doesn't require a clinical diagnosis to be destructive. Look at the caring versus caring scale.
Meaning supporting someone versus absorbing their total emotional weight?
Yes, if you are trapped in a family triangle, constantly playing the peacekeeper, you are carrying them. You are trying to communicate with a burning building. At what point do you stop negotiating with the fire and just exit the structure?
You exit when the building is actually burning down. But if it's just a pot boiling over on the stove, you don't abandon the house. You turn down the heat. And we do that through clear requests and mutual respect.
Well, hold on. This brings us to a really crucial distinction we have to unpack. The anatomy of a request versus a true boundary, or even an ultimatum. People conflate these terms all the time.
They really do. And if we want to resolve this tension between connection and protection, we have to look at how boundaries are actually scripted. Effective boundary scripts often look exactly like collaborative requests.
Can you give an example of what you mean?
Sure, say your boss or your partner hands you a massive new demand, but you are already at capacity. A highly effective relational script is, I would love to take this on. To ensure I can deliver it, what current priorities should we move so I have space to accomplish it?
That is a great script for managing a reasonable person. But psychologically speaking, it is fundamentally a request, not a boundary.
How is it not a boundary? It is actively setting a limit on your capacity. It prevents burnout while showing you're collaborative. It invites compromise. It is the ultimate relational bridge.
I have to push back hard on this. Conflating a request with a boundary is exactly where victims of covert narcissism lose their power. The difference comes entirely down to the locus of control.
Okay, break down the locus of control in this context.
A request places the locus of control on the other person. You are asking them to change their behavior. Please let me drop this project. Or please don't use that sarcastic tone with me. It relies entirely on their compliance.
Which, as we established, a manipulative person will just ignore or mock.
Precisely. A true boundary, however, keeps the locus of control firmly within yourself. It dictates your own action. If you continue to use micro-insults, I will leave the room. You don't need their permission.
But in practice, don't they function sequentially? You make the request first, and the boundary backs it up.
They might, but the boundary is the consequence. Dr. Henry Cloud points out that consequences must be naturally occurring and enforced exclusively by you. And we also have to separate boundaries from ultimatums.
Right, because ultimatums are usually rooted in anger, right? Like, if you don't change, I'm leaving.
Yes, an ultimatum is an external attempt to control someone else. A boundary is simply an internal mechanism protecting the self. I will not participate in conversations where I am being insulted. It only requires your own internal fortitude to enforce.
I see the conceptual distinction, and it is a very valid framework for protection. But even when you execute a strict behavior-driven boundary, the foundational goal is usually still relational health. Let's go back to the Gottman example, taking a 30-minute break when you are flooded.
The timeout protocol.
Yes, the script is, I'm flooded, I need 30 minutes to calm down, and then I can come back to this. You are physically removing your body. That is a strict boundary. But the ultimate goal is to come back to this.
If they let you.
Well, the break allows your prefrontal cortex to come back online so you can return and repair the connection. The boundary is the very mechanism that saves the relationship from permanent damage.
It is an act of kindness, if and only if your partner is acting in good faith. But look at the systemic reality. If your partner is a covert narcissist, they will not view that break as a biological reset. They will view it as an insult to their control.
Right, they feel abandoned.
Yes, so they will chase you into the next room. They will literally stand outside the bathroom door arguing with you, violating the physical boundary you just set.
Ugh, which happens all the time to people walking on eggshells.
Exactly. And that is why the boundary cannot be contingent on repairing the relationship. It must be entirely contingent on your psychological safety. If they chase you, the boundary escalates. You leave the house, you turn off your phone.
But again, I feel like you are defining the fundamental rule of boundaries by the worst-case exception.
Because the exception is what destroys people's mental health. When we broadly tell listeners that boundaries are tools for connection, we inadvertently encourage victims to keep trying to connect with people who are fundamentally toxic.
They get stuck in the change-back cycle.
Yes, they endure endless extinction bursts, holding out hope that if they just find the perfect SAFE script, their emotionally immature parent or manipulative boss will finally respect them. It is a one-way ticket to complete psychological burnout.
And I would counter that if we tell people every boundary must be a unilateral defensive fortress, we create a society of deeply isolated individuals. We train people to view every minor interpersonal friction as a toxic violation. We lose the grace and the compromise required for genuine human connection.
Grace is reserved for people who respect your limits once they are made aware of them.
But how do they become aware without the collaborative communication I am advocating for?
They become acutely aware through the friction of the consequence. When you stop over-functioning on that seesaw, when you stop jading and handing them ammunition, they become aware. You don't have to explain a wall for it to do its job.
So as we synthesize this, it seems we have arrived at a fascinating impasse, but also a point of deep convergence. We both vehemently agree that porous boundaries are dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
When boundaries are too soft, it leads to chronic codependency, a total loss of identity, and quiet, rotting resentment. We entirely agree that every individual listening has the absolute right to step out of the people-pleasing trap.
Precisely. You don't have to set yourself on fire just to keep a covert narcissist warm. We agree on the pathology of porous boundaries. Where we diverge is on the ultimate execution. You view the boundary as a surgical tool to save the relationship.
Right.
I view it as a heavy shield designed to save oneself, recognizing that sometimes saving oneself explicitly requires letting the relationship fail.
And I maintain that a well-articulated boundary is a bridge. It replaces the murky waters of resentment with the absolute clarity of mutual respect. It allows us to ask for what we need without making assumptions.
And I maintain that relying on communication alone leaves you incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. A true boundary requires the internal fortitude to enforce consequences, completely regardless of whether the other person approves of your limit.
Which suggests that for our listeners, the approach really depends on the emotional maturity of the people in their own lives. If you are dealing with a healthy partner who just made a misstep, you need a gate. You need dialogue.
Exactly. You have to look at the history of their reaction. Do they want repair or do they want control? If you are dealing with a toxic system or a covert manipulator who plays the victim, you need a fire break. You need a consequence.
Human relationships are endlessly complex, and there is clearly so much more to explore in this material regarding our own psychological boundary continuums. The daily application is entirely up to you. So when you look at the demarcations in your own life, are you building a gate or are you building a wall?